Jason Beardsley. Jason, do you think this is enough to deter the Houthis, or is this the start of a bigger conflict, the risk here of escalation?
Well, it's appreciate that it's certainly not enough to quell what the Houthis have been engaged in for a long time. But to your previous guest, Jerome Stark, he mentions this goes back a way. This is Iranian influence and malign influence in the region. And it has been progressive, but we can dial it all the way back 10 years, 20 years when I'm a combat soldier who fought in Iraq, and Iran was very much responsible for a lot of the interdiction and harassment in the region, to include killing U.S. soldiers. So this is not new for them. They've been getting away from it for a long time. So I think they've been emboldened over the years. And when you watch the last several years, maybe even decade of our policies, it sort of leaves the door open and, as you said, risk a little bit of escalation here. So what's really going to be required is a lot of discipline in the statescraft executive offices, both in the White House and the United Kingdom. But I think this is not one that we're looking at wrapping up soon.
And just in terms of that, you mentioned wider escalation in that particular region and the UK and the US having to take very measured steps going forward. They have also been very keen to stress this is a multi-agency approach across many, many countries. But just in terms of Iran, and I mentioned this earlier, all of these Iranian-backed rebels, all of those groups, what is Iran's end game here?
I mean, this is very classic regional hegemony sort of empire movements. And you think in the region about keeping the United States off balance, but also enforcing the idea that you are the regional power and flexing that muscle when possible, demonstrating the prowess and the acumen of that, of the Iranian sort of regime, whether it's in Lebanon or whether it's in Israel or whether it's in Yemen. And then you have the IRGC-QF that has spread its tentacles throughout the world. So they've got a pretty good hand at doing this, and they have not been stopped. So a lot of, if you watch in the last 10 years, the presidents in the United States and others have been working to try to negotiate types of deals with Iran, looking very much like Iran has more of the leverage in these places. But they're not alone either. China's watching, Russia's watching. A lot of what's happening on the ground in Ukraine is fueling how they're fighting, their tactics, their drone warfare, the idea of how they're going after our ships. And don't forget, since October 7th, the United States troops in Syria, in Iraq, have been attacked over 100 times. So what I think you're seeing is regional statescraft that's sort of keeping the West off balance. And this is a lot of focus for both the United Kingdom and the United States. And while it is a coalition effort, we all know who's pulling the heavy weight here.
Yeah, Jason, you mentioned Russia there, and Russia's response has been to request an urgent meeting of the United Nations Security Council to discuss these strikes on Yemen by the US and Britain. Obviously, we're in the very early stages of this, but what do you anticipate the next steps of this in the coming hours?
It's very difficult to tell. I mean, Russia obviously is backed in its own corner and working in its own rights to secure the land bridge to Crimea. And so they've got a little bit of maneuver room with these type of attacks distracting the West in the Middle East. And I think that's part of the larger play that's suspect. So we don't actually know what's going to happen. And unfortunately, we're going to have to wait as these days tick on. But notice again, this has not started in the last week or so. This has been ongoing for several months. And so the escalation, the small drip, 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 is really going to require, if the executive offices don't get it together and make some disciplined moves, this can get very dangerous quickly. And we have to be careful that we don't need to be drawn into another regional conflict.
Well, Iran this morning has strongly condemned these UK and US attacks against the Houthis, saying it's a violation of Yemen's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Also, a senior Houthi official has said the US-Britain strikes on Yemen are barbaric and they will issue a response soon. Also, a lot of breaking news coming in about major battles possibly erupting in the Red Sea. There's no evidence of that at the moment.
Yeah, let's begin too with the Houthi government's slogan, their motto. The Al Ansar motto is "Death to America, death to Israel." a curse on the Jews and victory to Islam. So we're talking about a lot of folks who have had 20 and 30 years of sort of insurrection and guerrilla type mentality, and the backing of a state like Iran, which includes the technology you mentioned before, the warfare. So again, this is not an easy situation. I very much empathize with both the president and the prime minister. They're backed up against the wall. There was no good answer here. We didn't have the option not to strike. But at the same time, a strike that's limited in this nature is not going to do the type of damage it would take to cease these operations, these hostilities. So this is a buckle it up and strap in for a little bit. And we really are going to need as much statecraft here as possible, as much diplomacy to get out of this situation. But I will tell you, I'm a little bit suspect. I've watched this now unfold in Iraq and Afghanistan in over 20 years. There's a lot of talk about how to quell an insurgency or how to, soften a rebellion, and we haven't been able to do that. So hold on.
The aim seems to be, Jason, giving the Houthi rebels a punch in the nose, effectively, and to get out quickly. But there is, as the US and UK have both stressed, room for escalation if required.
Sure. Right. And make no mistake, the Houthis actually benefit from this. A strike by the West on Yemen territory emboldens and enforces their sort of constituency and allows them to kind of repatriate that with their followers and their supporters. It's always kind of a decent bet. They're not going to lose everything. And to Jerome's point earlier, there's a lot of stock and munitions that they will have ongoing or on call in the future. It's not like we're going to exhaust their war capabilities. You saw that up in Ukraine. You see that with Russia. You see that in other areas. So they can reach out to other partners for this. So that's what makes this a very difficult situation, which is going to require a lot of discipline. So this is not a good situation to be in. I think both the president and the prime minister took the right moves. I think going to Parliament, going to Congress is going to be the next stage. And a lot of folks are going to have to sit down and figure out where they want to go on this one.
Can I just ask you, in terms of domestic policy and indeed the way people are feeling here in the UK and indeed in the US, a lot of people are very war-weary about UK and US foreign policy generally. How worried should we be?
I think it's a very concerning thing. And we're in a political election cycle this year. So we're going to have a chance to see national candidates talk about that, and we're going to find out how much the street, America, at least is weighing in on this. But as you said, war weary is let's call that a gracious term. My peers and I are very much distressed watching the withdrawal from Afghanistan. It feels like we've been getting kicked in the gut a little bit here and there. So we're really, really going to be looking for politicians, congressmen, senators, presidents, others to buckle down and figure out how do they want to execute a plan and what does that look like. And what we haven't heard much of is how these things end, or what the goal or what the scope or scale or limit of these operations are. And as long as I'm not hearing that, as a soldier, I'm missing the entire point. So a lot of that diplomacy and talk that's vague in general is going to be a continual frustration for people that are watching at home. I empathize, but this means it's the place where the West does best, right? The consent of the governed. If we don't make our voices heard to our senior leaders and our elected officials, there's no holding them back.
One quick final thought from you, Jason. The timing of this happening while the US Defense Secretary is incapacitated in hospital, how significant is that?
Well, I'll separate the actual tragedy of that circumstance from the actual working of the Department of Defense. Regardless of his abilities at this stage, the Department of Defense is a well-oiled machine. And as you all pointed out, we were well aware of these attacks really in the last month, the last 2 months. So this has been a plan that everybody's already aware of. The Department of Defense knows how to do this work, and we'll have responsible people in his place. I'm setting aside the politics of the Secretary of Defense being missing in action for a little while. I think that's a little embarrassing, and I think the White House knows that. But clearly, we have seen a little less accountability in our senior leadership at the military level than I think is necessary to cause them to do anything about that. So a lot of us in America, I think, are frustrated with that. And again, we're in a political cycle, so you're going to see that come out in the wash.
Jason Beardsley, thank you very much indeed for giving us your thoughts and expertise here this morning.